The world has never seen an economic machine like China. In just 4 decades, a nation of farmers became the factory of the planet, building the cities, highways, ports, and supply chains that power the modern world. It consumes more concrete, produces more steel, and exports more goods than any civilization in history. To the outside world, China's rise looks unstoppable, an inevitable march toward becoming the next global superpower. But behind the skyscrapers of Shanghai, the automated factories of Shenzhen, and the numbers showing endless growth, something is breaking. The very systems that created China's miracle are beginning to turn against it. A shrinking population, an economy built on mountains of debt, and a world that is slowly closing its doors. For the first time in decades, Beijing is facing a question it cannot avoid. What happens when the fastest growing power on Earth starts running out of time? This is a red line, where we uncover the hidden systems, decisions, and forces shaping the future of our world. And today, we explore why China's greatest challenge may not come from another superpower, but from within. At its core, macroeconomics is driven by simple variables: people, capital, and productivity. For decades, China possessed an unmatched abundance of the first variable. Its economic miracle was fueled by a massive, young, and cheap workforce migrating from rural fields to urban factories. This demographic dividend gave Beijing an unassailable edge in manufacturing. But that dividend has expired. The historical legacy of the one-child policy, combined with modern urban economic pressures, has triggered one of the sharpest fertility declines in documented history. Consider the data. In 2022, China's population shrank for the first time in 60 years, a full decade earlier than Beijing's official projections anticipated. By 2023, the contraction accelerated. The country's fertility rate has cratered to roughly 1.0, far below the 2.1 replacement level required to sustain a stable society. The systemic consequences of this decline alter the balance of global labor. China's working-age population peaked around 2011. Since then, it has been in a steady, irreversible retreat. Over the next 2 decades, the nation is projected to lose over 100 million workers, a labor force contraction roughly equivalent to the entire population of Germany. This massive shrinkage alters the fundamental equation of state power. As the workforce diminishes, the dependency ratio skyrockets. The nation is rapidly transitioning into a 4-2-1 family structure, where a single working child is legally and financially responsible for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. This structural shift creates a double-edged economic crisis. On one end, tax revenues shrink as fewer people enter the workforce. On the other end, expenditures on healthcare, Social Security, and elder pensions explode. Unlike Western nations that grew wealthy before the populations aged, China is facing an existential demographic inversion. It is growing old before it grows rich. To offset this labor deficit, a state must drastically increase its productivity or capital efficiency. But Beijing's second major pillar, its investment-heavy growth model, is also failing. Following the 2008 global financial crisis, when Western markets plummeted, China sustained its high GDP growth targets through a massive influx of domestic credit. It embarked on the largest infrastructure binge in human history, building thousands of miles of high-speed rail, massive airport networks, and entire metropolitan districts from scratch. For years, this worked flawlessly. But infrastructure investment suffers from a brutal law of economics, the law of diminishing returns. Building a highway between 2 major industrial cities yields massive economic returns. Building a 5th highway in a depopulated rural province yields almost nothing. Yet, the credit engine kept running. The capital is flowing, but it is accumulating in regions that offer zero long-term strategic viability. Today, China's economic growth is heavily over-leveraged, with a total debt-to-GDP ratio approaching 300%. A massive portion of this debt is concentrated within local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, and a highly volatile real estate sector. For 20 years, real estate served as a foundational bedrock of Chinese domestic wealth, accounting for nearly 30% of the country's total economic output and absorbing up to 70% of household savings. It was an economic perpetual motion machine until it broke. The collapse of major megadevelopers exposed a systemic crisis of overcapacity. China is now filled with an estimated 60 to 80 million empty apartments, enough to house the entire population of France. These are not assets. They are dead capital. Local governments, which historically relied on land sales to developers for a staggering 40% of their revenues, are suddenly facing fiscal insolvency. They can no longer afford to service their debts, let alone fund future innovation. With domestic consumption depressed by cratering property values and a shrinking population, Beijing has opted for a familiar playbook: printing money to double down on industrial manufacturing. The state is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into high-tech sectors, specifically electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and solar panels. The goal is to leapfrog the middle-income trap and establish total global dominance over the green energy supply chains of the 21st century. But this strategy has hit an unyielding wall: geopolitical reality. China's industrial strategy relies on the implicit assumption that the rest of the world will willingly absorb its massive excess capacity. That assumption is no longer valid. The United States and the European Union, viewing China's subsidized exports as an existential threat to their own domestic industries, are systematically erecting massive tariff walls. Washington has implemented sweeping technology blockades, cutting off China's access to advanced semiconductor chips and the lithography machines required to manufacture them. The global supply chain is actively decoupling or friendshoring, as multinational corporations ship production lines out China and into more politically stable alternatives like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. This economic isolation is compounded by a profound logistical vulnerability. China is an import-dependent superpower. It relies on external markets for 80% of its energy needs and a massive share of its agricultural inputs. The vast majority of these critical resources must pass through narrow maritime choke points, most notably the Strait of Malacca. In a geopolitical conflict, this trade corridor can be easily severed by naval blockades, instantly paralyzing the Chinese economy. Beijing's sweeping Belt and Road Initiative was explicitly designed to construct land-based alternatives across Eurasia, but these projects have turned into expensive, debt-ridden diplomatic quagmires rather than reliable logistical lifelines. The synthesis of these structural crises means China's window of opportunity is rapidly closing. The ruling Communist Party derives its political legitimacy from a fundamental social contract: the preservation of absolute political control in exchange for guaranteed, continuous economic prosperity. As growth slows from historical double-digit highs down toward stagnation, that social contract begins to fray. When the citizens begin to question their future, the entire administrative apparatus begins to shift its posture. This creates a dangerous geopolitical paradox. Historically, rising powers become most volatile not when they are weak, but when they realize their trajectory has peaked and time is running out. Beijing knows that its demographic crisis will become unmanageable by the 2030s, that its debt burden is unsustainable, and that its technological window is being actively shut by Western containment. This creates an intense systemic pressure to achieve long-term strategic objectives, such as the absorption of Taiwan and total dominance over the South China Sea, sooner rather than later. Ultimately, China is not facing a temporary slowdown that can be solved with another stimulus package or another wave of construction. It is facing the limits of the very system that created its rise: the endless factories, the massive cities, the investment machine that transformed China into an economic giant. These were once its greatest advantages, but today, they are becoming the structural traps that could define its future. The factory of the world is still running, but the workforce behind it is shrinking, the debts behind it are growing, and the geopolitical window around it is closing. China spent 40 years racing ahead of the world. Now the question is whether it can change direction before time runs out. This was The Red Line. Subscribe to understand the hidden forces shaping our world.